Hello, I'm Jill Vellerman and I'm a 5-step assessor and trainer. And this video, we're going to cover step 2, and that's all about providing information to family members. We're going to give you some tips and hints. So moving on to the stress strain coping support model. And we've discussed so far that this model suggests that the amount of strain caused by any given level of stress is influenced by 3 factors. And these are information, coping, and support. And this is about the first influencing factor, which is information. And as said, step 2 is about providing relevant and targeted information to family members. And what we know is, if family members feel well informed, it can be very empowering for them, and most importantly, it can reduce their stress levels. So take a little look at some of the quotes on the right hand side. And this family member is reflecting on how useful it was to both understand the cycle of change, how common relapse was, and techniques for remaining calm. And the practitioner reflected about how useful it was to be prepared for step 2 at the end of step 1, and also that it was really empowering to clarify with the family member about where to get accurate information. And we do stress about accurate information because family members may be looking up all sorts of things on the website, so it's useful for the practitioner to clarify reputable information and reputable websites. And the key thing for step 2 is that information needs and questions that the family members have should come from themselves. And as a practitioner, try to avoid making assumptions about what a family member needs to know about. And you should similarly avoid providing information without checking and discussing with them that it actually might be useful for them in the first place. Remember, our job as a practitioner is to remain in control of the process, of the structure of the 5-step method, while assisting the family member to be in control of the content about actually what's talked about. And sometimes it can be hard for the family member to articulate what questions they have or what needs they have. But remember, for you as the practitioner, you have the self-help handbook and you can work through some of the exercises in that. Secondly, you've also got the results from the family member questionnaire, and that can really help target the kind of information the family member would want clarifying. And sometimes, again, the family member is struggling to find what they might need. And it's fine then to also say, well, other family members have found this helpful, say, as an example, the cycle of change, or they found information about anxiety or trouble with sleeping. Would that be helpful for you? So moving on to a little bit more information about what kind of information family members might want and some tips. And one thing that's important is actually to dispel myths. So often family members, they might say, well, my husband, he can't be an alcoholic or a drug or a gambling addict because, and then they give a particular reason. They don't drink in the morning, or they sometimes stop for a week or more. And our task here is to help them see that this label isn't important. The issue for them as a family member is about what problems it causes the family member and others. Another myth is that one really can't do anything about the problem until the person themselves has hit rock bottom. But here again, our task is to provide information to show that people with even really serious problems can start to change if their situation changes, or sometimes small things change, and that's often what's called the nudge factor. Often providing information about the cycle of change can be really useful for affected family members. It can just help them see better where their relative is and how they might be changing. It's well known that providing information that is targeted and relevant can reduce stress, and the stress linked to misconceptions and also the stress of not knowing. The old adage of knowledge is power really applies here. Simply feeling informed, even if nothing else about the situation changes, makes people less stressed. And I say the results from our family member questionnaire really do back these up from decades of research. And family members do report that they feel more in control of the situation after step 2. But remember, finally, no advice. Our task here is to provide relevant and targeted information and not to be giving advice. This next slide covers all the competencies for step 2. And each of these has a number of elements. So as ever, there's the tasks around the beginning of the session. Then this is about exploring what specific information the family member might have in relation to the loved one's problem, substance use or problem gambling. After the specific information around that, it's about what general information the family member might want. And all kinds of things, mental health, finances, legal situation. And it's particularly important here to have the answers to some of the family member questionnaire questions, especially the ones around stress and strain can be useful. So the family member might have said that they were very worried, or they had financial difficulties, or they had problems sleeping, or any of the other areas that come up. These are really useful items to be prepared for in step 2, and you'll already know them from those results that you've got in step 1. Following this, it's about exploring what other members might need, and that might be other family members, or it could be important friends. Then it's about supporting the family member to be able to find out more for themselves about the things that have been discussed. And I mentioned before, things around reputable websites or libraries, things like that might be important for them. And then there's the task at the end of the session around using the handbook, summarising, checking how the session went and preparing for the next session. As ever, in addition to these, there are all the competencies around the core counselling skills as well. And particularly important is around the time management. Moving on, want to talk a bit more about the starting and the ending of a step 2 session. And this slide gives some key points. They're essentially the same for all steps, but how you communicate this to the family member will be slightly different for each session as you do it. Our learning shows it's incredibly important to get the start and the end of the session right. And it gives structure to the session, it can aid time management, and it ensures that you cover all that is required for the step. We illustrate in the step 1 video what a practitioner might say at the start and the end of step 1. And while we're not going to do this for every step, we do think it's helpful to give an example of what a practitioner might say at the start of step 2. This example will also include consideration of how a practitioner can ensure they check in with the family member about risk. This is a core counselling skill and one that should be covered at every session. So in summary, at the beginning of step 2, the practitioner should always warmly welcome the family member. Set a clear and structured agenda for the session and ensure that it's followed throughout the session. And check if the previous session was helpful and a reminder to see if they've got any questions. And give an overview of the step 2 in relation to the stress strain coping support model. The start of the session can also be a really good time to ensure if anything has changed with regards to risk and safety. But you can also do that in another part of the session, say towards the end, if that's more helpful. At the end of step 2, practitioners should always ask the family member if they want to summarise the main issues, and then you as the practitioner can also add in your summary if anything is missed. It's important to check if the session was helpful and in what ways. Do reiterate the use of the self-help handbook. I can't stress enough how many times family members have said how useful it is, how it normalises the situation and gives them some feeling of hope. And then explain the purpose of the next session, which in this case is step 3 about coping, and how that fits into the model. And then, as ever, there's the practical issues about the date and the time of the next meeting, and how, if they need to make emergency contact, what to do. What we want to move on to now is a little bit more detail. And this process that I mentioned at the start of the video is called the elicit, provide, elicit process. And it's a technique that's used in motivational interviewing. And it's a really useful way of structuring your work in step 2 to explore questions and information needs. And we suggest you work through all 3 stages of the process for each question or area of information that is covered in this session. Firstly, you need to work collaboratively with the family member to identify their questions and information needs, and that's the elicit part of the process. And it's largely informed by what was discussed in step 1, and hopefully you've clarified that at the end of step 1, so you're really prepared for this session. And if the family member struggles with knowing what they need, it's okay for you to make some suggestions based on what was discussed or to give some examples. And it's also incredibly important to use the information that you've gained from the family member questionnaire, and especially the questions about stress and strain, and to identify areas where they might find information really helpful. And very common things are around anxiety and worry and sleep. Secondly, you need to provide the required information to the family member, and you might have been able to obtain this between steps 1 and 2. So there might be some useful websites, and again, I stress the importance of accurate websites to use. It might be a leaflet. You might want to watch a video together with the family member, and there's plenty of examples obviously on the web and on the YouTube channels. For some questions and information needs, you might not have time to go into a huge amount of detail, so it's important to enable them to keep seeking out information, and I say to clarify websites, and if they don't have access to a computer or a tablet, that you might need to be sending some things in the post. The third and the final part of the process is one that practitioners commonly admit, and it's incredibly important to check with the family member about the information you've provided and discussed. Was it actually the information they wanted? How did it help? And for example, it could be in relation to their anxiety and stress, and has it raised further questions? So this is the second elicit, and if it raises further questions, then as a practitioner, you need to work through these in the same way. So there's going to be a clip at the end of this to show how to do this, a demonstration session. But what I want to do now is just to work through some of the common tips that are very useful. So the main thing is be prepared with what the family member might require. So this can be things that you've discussed in the family member questionnaire. And as well as rechecking that family member questionnaire, so you're prepared with some targeted information related to their needs, you can also have a reread through section 2 of the handbook. Secondly, before you start to give lots of information, do check what they already know. Sometimes providing information they already have can be counterproductive, and the family member feels you're not really personalising things for them. Importantly, don't just provide lots of information. Do provide it targeted and that it's relevant, and empower the family member to look for information on their own. Also, this step can create quite a lot of anxiety for the practitioner, but you don't need to know everything. Sometimes the family member might ask for something quite technical and it's information that we don't know. And of course, that can actually be worked to our advantage. So you can work collaboratively with the family member to obtain that information, say by doing an internet search at the time. And that can empower the family member to see they're also quite capable of finding out the information for themselves. And there's lots of information in the self-help handbook. And that can also encourage the family member to do some of the exercises in that handbook. And finally, as we've said before, do check issues of safety and possible abuse. Things do change from week to week, and it might not be safe for the family member to take home information. So the next slide simply shows some of the exercises from the self-help handbook. And as we always say, these can be incredibly useful for the family member.